Chapter 3: Building, Losing, and Turning Inward. This is the bit where people think they know what's coming. They rarely do. When Danny came back from the city, he didn't come back weak. He came back contained. That difference matters more than anyone realizes. Spike didn't vanish. He didn't soften. He didn't suddenly become unreasonable. What happened instead was compression. Everything that had once lived outward, the authority, the edge, the readiness to dominate space, folded inward under pressure. Same force, smaller footprint, like ramming power into a sealed chamber instead of letting it detonate in the open. That image isn't poetic. It's literal. That mattered, because for the first time in his life, chaos wasn't being flung outward just to survive it. It was being held, managed, watched. Observation without explosion. This is where people usually assume the story ends. City breaks you. Pressure humbles you. Man comes back calmer, wiser, fixed. That's not what happened. What actually changed was that Danny no longer needed to escape himself. And that's the crucial bit, because once you stop running from yourself, the world has to respond. Cannabis entered the picture here, not as recklessness or even recreational, not as collapse, not as numbing out. It wasn't about running. It was about slowing the internal spin just enough that something new could form. Sedation, not destruction. A governor on an engine that had been redlining for years. Alchemy, not avoidance. And it worked. The chaos wasn't being silenced. It was being organized. That's architecture, not coping. For the first time, Danny could observe what was happening inside him without being dragged by it. Thoughts didn't scatter immediately into violence or impulse. Emotions didn't have to explode to be acknowledged. There was space, just enough space to notice patterns. Space is where magic lives. And in that space, something strange started happening. Danny began to meet himself. Not metaphorically, literally. Most people will never get this far. Spike was there, still dominant, still coiled and ready. Chuck was there, scarred, resilient, built to absorb punishment without breaking. And underneath both of them was the child version of Danny, his mother's son, little Dan. The one who learned early that safety wasn't guaranteed and attention had to be earned by hard work and results. That's the Trinity: power, survival, innocence. This wasn't fantasy. It wasn't dissociation. It was mapping. Real magic always looks like systems when you understand it. For the first time, Danny wasn't just building mental structure. He was building internal relationships, understanding who did what, who reacted how, which parts took over under pressure and which ones vanished. That's sovereignty, quietly forming. This is where the earliest outlines of the mind fortress began to make itself known. Not as an escape, not as a retreat, but as a control system. Implosions instead of explosions, divisions instead of bleed-through, clear boundaries where emotions could be placed, examined, and moved instead of detonated. This is not madness. This is engineering, not madness, management. And here's where the universe leans in. And as the internal world started organizing itself, something else happened that always happens with drag and Capricorn wiring. The external world had to bring balance. Inside construction, outside being dismantled. This is the price of alignment, which is where self-sabotage quietly stepped in. Because when structure starts forming internally, anything externally misaligned becomes intolerable. Not consciously, instinctively, the system rejects what doesn't fit. This is gravity doing its job. This is where Red the rooster sits in the story. After B the dragon, the rooster became the next serious long-term shape, almost chaos trying to cancel out chaos for chaos's sake. An actual attempt at building something real. Wrong shape, right intention, and this matters. Pip was a baby while Danny was with Red. That alone rewrites everything. So this wasn't casual. This wasn't temporary. This was the first relationship since B that carried real weight. The first woman Pip's life was structured around. They got a dog, shared responsibility, went on holidays, day trips, a genuine attempt to anchor something ordinary on unstable ground. This was him trying to stay, but it didn't click. And misalignment always reveals itself eventually. It didn't work because internally, Danny had already cut a shape out of something else, something that the rooster couldn't fill. Danny's unrealistic expectations of the perfect relationship with a soulmate. You can't force the wrong geometry, because without realizing it, he had been forming the outline of the person he would actually meet if he could in his mind all his life. Calm without stagnation, depth without chaos, presence without threat. Lunar, grounded, quietly inevitable. Fierce but safe. And red wasn't that. So the universe did what it always does when misalignment persists. It accelerated. It always does. Tension rose, friction increased. Small things became unmanageable, dramatically, sometimes explosively, unsustainably. Temptation, deceit, mistrust, suspicion, two big personalities, one big fucking mess, just force. The relationship burned through itself faster than it could stabilize, and the universe did what it tends to do with Dragon Capricorn patterns. It removed the piece, not cleanly, not kindly, just efficiently. That's not cruelty. That's correction. What followed wasn't absence. It was clarification. Silence teaches faster than pain. There had been others before, of course. People passing through, short overlaps, filler relationships, background figures occupying space while the structure was still forming. They don't matter here. They don't follow through. They were extras. This story only keeps what holds weight. And like B the dragon, Red would now sit in the background. Silent. The ones who remained were different. Cain was still there, still whispering, still nudging, still pointing at instability like its opportunity, never forcing, just suggesting. And this is where people usually laugh it off, because it sounds poetic. But it isn't. It's tactical. This is how influence actually moves. And in the background, his little bird remained too. Not foreground, not demanding, orbiting just outside the frame. Close enough to register, quiet enough not to disrupt the build. A constant signal rather than a presence that needed decoding. That's the bit most people miss. The ones who last don't shout. They hover. Staying is never accidental. It's a choice made over and over. And that mattered more than he realized at the time. Because while everything else had been burning off, collapsing, or being stripped away, these two long-term threads were quietly holding their shape. The snake and the monkey. Temptation and intelligence. Chaos and interpretation. Fire and timing. And that recognition that some connections endure without pressure, without escalation, without chaos, began seeping into the internal architecture as the mind fortress took form. This is the moment the system stops being defensive and starts being selective. Not as answers, as reference points, anchors, coordinates, places to return to when everything else is moving. And this is where things get interesting. Because this is where coincidence runs out. Because up to now, everything still looks like coincidence if you want it to. A family perfectly aligned to misunderstand him. One dragon who reflected the fighter. One dragon who reflected the lover. A chaos karmic the snake. A misunderstood, mistimed, slightly misplaced monkey. A hurricane rooster in Jody. All of it explainable. All of it dismissible. Except Danny didn't go looking for any of them. He didn't choose these encounters. He didn't hunt them down. He didn't orchestrate the meetings. They found him. They entered his life at exactly the moment their function was required. Not by intention, but by timing. As if the system was assembling itself through people rather than plans. That's sequence. That's important. It's when the story stops being about choice and starts being about sequence. And sequence has rules. And sequence has gravity. Heavy things fall whether you believe in them or not. Once things calmed, once the chaos stopped screaming and started humming, the world tried to civilize him. It tried to make him normal, back in his childhood home, back in a house that never quite fit, back in a role that made sense to everyone else but landed awkwardly on him. But a father now, a responsibility, a reason to stay still, to behave, to be sensible, to slot into the shape of something recognizable. This is how cages are built, politely. No one demanded it outright. That's the trick. Control rarely raises its voice. Expectation doesn't shout. It settles. It seeps. It forms grooves you don't notice yourself sliding into. Conversations about stability, about routine, about what comes next, about doing the right thing. By the time you notice, you're already inside it. The matrix tightening quietly, and most people never feel it close. And Danny, contained, organized, no longer burning, didn't fight it. Because for the first time, he didn't need to. That's not surrender. That's confidence. So the system moved him gently, invisibly, like all real forces do, towards something ordinary, toward a role that looks small on the outside. This is where Danny found himself in a theme park kitchen. And once again, dragon instinct kicked in. He didn't just work there, he claimed competence. Authority doesn't announce itself, it settles. Kitchen work had always made sense to Danny. Pressure made sense. Hierarchy, timing, unspoken rules, all familiar territory. Danny rose quickly, not because he chased authority, but because authority gravitates toward people who know exactly what the fuck they're doing. That's gravity again. Work stabilized him. Life did not. It never does. And almost without him noticing, something else was already unfolding around him. A fault line, a quiet dispute, tension moving through the structure above his head, unseen from the floor where he stood doing the work. Decisions being mishandled, responsibility being dodged. The ship taking on water long before anyone admitted it was sinking. This is where dragons always appear, right before collapse. Danny didn't arrive looking for authority. He arrived when it was already failing. That's the pattern. And when things started to slip, when pressure hit and no one else stepped forward, the system did what systems always do. It handed the wheel to the one who was steady. Not the loudest, the steadiest. Not by promotion, not by ambition. By default, default is destiny wearing work clothes. Because he was there. Because he was capable. Because when things go wrong, dragons don't ask for permission. They take responsibility. That's not ego. That's wiring. So without choosing it, without chasing it, without even naming it yet, Danny found himself captaining a ship that had already started to list. Not through ego, through gravity. There it is again. And that mattered because it confirmed something deeper. Even when he wasn't trying to lead, leadership kept finding him. At a certain point, you stop calling that coincidence. But while he stood there with a sinking ship under his feet, the karmic snake cane hissing in his ear, and all the old responsibilities already stacked on his back, life still had the audacity to throw in more. Ella drifted into the equation like that. Almost irrelevant. Almost just there. Not some great romance. Not a grand temptation. Not even lust like that. Distraction. Something that fills a gap while everything else is grinding. Not passion, not madness. Just emptiness. The quiet kind that makes bad decisions feel inevitable. And the universe has a funny way of turning nothing into consequence. Funny like a loaded gun left on a table. Funny like gravity pretending it isn't there because she fell pregnant. And there it is. No drum roll, no warning, just impact. Danny didn't run. Of course he didn't. Dragons don't flee consequence. They square up to it. He reorganized. That's the wiring. That's the dragon Capricorn pattern in its rawest form. When responsibility appears, it's accepted immediately, even when it hurts, even when it's uncertain, even when there's no proof it will ever be rewarded. No bargaining, no resentment, just right then. Let's carry this. But the mum refused him access, blocked him, and intentionally removed him. Danny was there for his birth. But once she realized Danny didn't want to be with her, she retaliated. So Danny held the idea of that child in silence, heavier than people think, heavier than noise, unseen, quiet, permanent. And by now, Danny was back in the family home, pulled into a version of himself that had never really fit. The small Danny, the compliant Danny, the one expected to behave to be grateful, to keep its head down. Fatherhood layered on top of it. Another child born not from planning, not from stability, but from consequence. Two children who didn't live with him. One saw him at weekends, the other not at all. Work became the only external regulator, a pressure valve, a place where rules were clear and competence mattered. And hovering just outside it all was the snake again, whispering, nudging, reminding him how easy it would be for Danny to destabilize everything if he wanted to. The snake never shouts, he never has to. At the same time, friendships from the city had almost completely fallen away. Distance does that. Time erodes things. People fade into shapes and then into memory. No betrayals, no explosions, just erosion except her, his little bird. And this is where the pattern starts to glow. She stayed, not loud, not claiming, just still there. This is raw truth. At that point, however, he was introduced to someone new, a dog. And here comes the counterweight. She wasn't fantasy or chaos. She was grounding, capable, practical. Where Danny lived in intensity, she brought structure. They worked together, lived together, planned together. When Danny poured everything into the small holding they purchased together beside the theme park, it wasn't impulses. It was hope, animals, a petting zoo, a future that felt tangible. This was him trying, genuinely, to set roots. Roots from seeds planted when he was young. This wasn't madness. This was effort. because she wasn't just another relationship. No, she was something else entirely. She was the dog. And that changes the math. And that matters more than most people ever realize. In Chinese psychology, dragon and dog aren't meant to work. Not even a little bit. They sit opposite each other on the wheel. Natural antagonists, different instincts, different values, different ways of standing in the world, fire and perimeter, vision and vigilance. The dragon moves by vision, intensity, momentum. It burns forward, creates gravity, reshapes terrain by existing loudly enough. It trusts instinct over instruction, force over reassurance. Momentum incarnate. The dog doesn't do any of that. And that's not weakness, that's design. The dog is grounded, loyal, practical, built around duty, routine, and protection of what already exists. Where the dragon looks at the horizon, the dog looks at the perimeter. Where the dragon wants expansion, the dog wants safety. Where the dragon thrives in chaos, the dog tries to manage it into something livable, holding the line while the world moves. They repel. Every chart says no. In reality, they sometimes lock together so hard it's impossible to pull them apart. Because need overrides theory. That was the temptation, the dream of rest without collapse. This wasn't fire meeting fire. This was fire meeting earth, intensity meeting structure, vision meeting responsibility. Not a mirror, but a counterweight. Not reflection, resistance. And for a dragon who spent most of his life oscillating between burning and collapsing, that felt different. Dangerous in a quieter way. Not exciting in the same way. Not chaotic in the same way. Unfamiliar but intriguing, almost believable, inviting, almost safe. An alternative chaos, slower, heavier, a quieter one, the kind that doesn't announce itself. She didn't amplify Danny's intensity. She almost contained it. She didn't reflect the dragon. She resisted it. And in that resistance was something seductive. The idea that maybe force could finally rest against something solid without tearing it apart. The fantasy of equilibrium. They tried to make it work because, in a way, it made sense precisely because it shouldn't. Dragons love impossible equations. The dragon and the dog attempting balance through opposition, trying to build something neither of them would have chosen instinctively, but both of them wanted badly enough to attempt. Effort without alignment. It was a new milestone, not repetition, not karma looping, not karmic echo, not chaos. Something untested, something else entirely. And that's why it mattered. And for a while it almost held. Almost is a cruel word. And this is where the myth stops being gentle. The small holding was never theirs. They had been deceived, fucking conned. Their money was gone. The animals, creatures they had bonded with, had to be rehomed, now gone. And the theme park owner, seeing conflict where there was only desperation, fired them both. Total collapse, drama, spectacle, just everything gone at once. For a dragon who commits fully before trusting, this cut deep. Not because of pride, but because it reinforced a brutal pattern. Even when Danny builds something carefully, it still gets taken away. This was a new chaos, a chaos now being born from grief. The animals that Danny's inner child, little Dan, had bonded with internally, reminding him of his childhood, but also his daughter Pip, her attachment and displacement. A heavy, different grief. Not rage, not fury, grief. The kind that sinks into bone. Grief only a father feels when they know their actions have had consequences for their children. A shared grief, a father-daughter bond. Something only forged between them because of Pip's thick ox skin and patience. She learned from her dad. She didn't shy from it, even if Danny didn't know it. And this right here, this is the bit people never fucking understand. This isn't theory. This isn't psychology. This is lived weight. That kind of grief rewrites you. He was also grieving for another child with no emotional attachments, not knowing how to feel it at all. When grief and guilt collide, that collision, that's fucking cosmic. That's where things start bending, because there is more. The loss of power and influence, not just from being Spike, but now also the grief of losing another crew in his position as the captain of this ship. The very ship he repaired and kept afloat, built it, held it together, then watched it go. That's not failure. That's pattern. And where was his karmic brother in all this? Absent, of course. He had already nudged Danny into the chaos unknowingly. So of course he was gone. The snake always leaves when the lesson's about to land. And if that wasn't enough, loss, abandonment, and grief inside internally. There was the grief of what home felt like with B. Even if he didn't know it. You don't go from a comfortable grown-up home life to utter chaos to another home life without comparing the two. But also the slow subconscious realization that a dog would not resonate with the vibration and gravitational pull of his own lunar counterpart. This is where the myth starts to show its teeth. This isn't preference. This is gravity. At this point, Danny, even if he seemed fully functional on the surface, because that's what dragons do, especially dragon Capricorns, even more so for a double dragon Capricorn, on the surface, calm, functional, seemingly normal, that's autopilot. Inside, a fucking mess. And by contrast, that's not exaggeration, that's the engine room. But most people would never even suspect. But this is the point where grief created a darkness that shrouded the ground level. Danny's internal mind space, a primitive settlement still needing proper realization and conscious attention. Knowledge was accumulating quicker than the mind space knew what to do. The library began taking shape, unaware of it. All the psychological books and research material autopilot Danny was reading stacked up. The life experiences and lessons the outside world was teaching him overflowed. Even the stories he would read to his daughter Pip, all of it filling ground level. Do you see it yet? This isn't madness. This is construction without blueprints. But not like a flood, more like the wind. This is borderline fucking genius. The problem wasn't the overload of information. There was just no place to store it, no real organization. So what does a dragon Capricorn do when the mind needs structure? What does Danny do? The diagnosed schizophrenic? He makes space, the only way he can, by creating a world he belongs to and can make sense of. Not to escape, no, to rationalize. That distinction, that's everything. And what else would he build when his innocent mind, the child Dan, meets the architects of love and war, while at the same time as reading fantasy to his daughter? Nothing less than a fortress, a mind castle, with a damn library, a place that now has room for knowledge, opportunity for observation. And this is where the myth becomes architecture. This is crucial, because this is when the system needed order. Not just order for order's sake, no. Delegation. And with delegation comes responsibility, and this needs architecture to support it. Dan, the child, innocent, harmless, playful, creative. In a garden, the safest place for a child. Chuck, born from discipline and adaptation, using humor as a way to laugh off the humiliation and deal with the harshness of the traveler world, now shares the stories lightheartedly around the fire with a drink in hand. You can see them, can't you? Not symbols, people. Spike wasn't going to stand aside either. This was Danny's armor, his weapon, his go-to offense, and his most volatile defense. Spike wasn't going to sit in the garden or just laugh it off. No. Spike demanded his own space, a training ground, a place to fine-tune his precision and strategy, a place to strengthen, a place he could emerge from when and if the time was called for. The psychology here is fucking cosmic, but it's not because Danny just put versions of himself into pigeonholes. His mind can't differentiate between past roles and emotions or instinct. Instead, it builds the infrastructure around it. The library collects knowledge with no librarian. The maze around the walls are now grown and continue to do so. The more knowledge collected, the thicker the maze becomes, as Danny learns not just how to say things, but when and why. That's wisdom, not intelligence. Relationships still prove difficult, however. Their ghosts wander ground level, dancing with trauma monsters and demons of failure and disappointment. Not Pip. Her presence was already in the garden with little Dan, and this is what made him Pip's dad specifically. Because if Danny didn't have that garden, he would never have been able to connect with her without chaos. And that is so fucking crucial to their relationship. This is the heart of it. This is the quiet miracle. She didn't need to overcome mazes or walls. She was already planted in the garden like a tree he can watch grow. That again only assisted the guilt and grief, a darkness that needed addressing. And so the sun rose, the clouds parted, and amongst the storms, Danny was the sun. And this is where he first caught a glimpse of everything. But he didn't know it yet. The sun wasn't the only thing there, but also a moon. There's always a counterpart. The moon was not a past role or version of Danny. It wasn't Danny at all. It was a reflection of him. The force his soul would be attached to. His idea of what the perfect soulmate would be. And with a sun that chases the lunar glow of the moon. Light was slowly clearing grief and creating clarity. There's nothing dramatic about that kind of clarity. It doesn't announce itself. It just shows up quietly and refuses to leave. Slowly is the key word. No revelations, no miracles, just enough light to keep going. And despite the chaos, something felt undeniable and real. Fatherhood anchored him in ways nothing else ever had. Some anchors don't pull you down. They hold you in place when everything else is trying to tear loose. That kind of grounding isn't philosophical. It's chemical. Nervous system level, bone deep, and still, somewhere else, a child he never knew existed beyond reach. Two versions of fatherhood, one real, one imagined, both heavy. That's the part people miss. You don't get to choose which weights matter. You just learn how to carry more than one. That's not contradiction. That's parallel weight. And carrying both at once changes a man. Cannabis use increased during this period. Not recklessly, not really even recreational, even if it seemed that way, but functionally. It became the lubricant that kept the internal machinery from grinding itself apart. Survival doesn't always look dignified. It looks like making sure the system keeps running. However, you have to do it. People love moralizing that kind of choice. They rarely understand the mechanics of survival, and as the external world grew more unstable, Danny turned inward more deliberately. This is where the fine portrait stops being abstract and becomes architectural. Designated spaces, clear internal hierarchies, not madness. Management. That distinction is everything. Because chaos without structure gets mislabeled by people who've never had to engineer their own stability. That line matters. Because chaos unmanaged looks the same as madness to people who've never had to build order from the inside. And soon, when everything else was stripped away, Danny would follow the instinct that had been forming all along. If the world could not give him solid ground, he would create his own. That's not retreat. That's authorship.